It has no empirical referent. Nothing that it refers to of an empirical nature. So then, if most of the propositions and questions found in philosophy are nonsensical, what job is left for philosophy other than shutting up? And the response is 40031. Philosophy is this critique of language, analyzing uses of language in order to determine whether or not they have empirical meaning, whether or not they have any sense. If they do not, then you label them as such, forget them. If they do, then whether they are true or false can be decided by the appropriate empirical sciences. Philosophy is not in the business of deciding the truth of anything. If all meaning is empirical, then the truth of propositions is a scientific matter, not philosophical. So philosophy becomes, as it were, the logic of language switchboard, which accepts calls asking, can you help me with this confusing sort of topic? And shuttles the calls, plugs them into the different sciences. The function of philosophy is simply logic, the logic of language. And then 411, it follows that the totality of true propositions is the whole of natural science. Now remember that I used in introducing this the term scientism. What's scientism? The view that only scientific knowledge is worthy. Only that which comes by scientific method, can be verified by scientific method, is worthy. It's acceptable. A scientific exclusivism, which is obviously being touted in the 19th century empiricists, here again in the early Wittgenstein, and in the logical positivists. Okay? But for 111, philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. It aims at the logical clarification of thoughts. It's not a body of doctrine, but an activity. And that last sentence you can underscore and so forth. So you should no longer, according to Wittgenstein, talk of somebody's philosophy as if it's a body of doctrine. Don't talk of Hegel's philosophy, a body of doctrine, you see. You talk rather of people who are doing philosophy. Now, that phrase is something Wittgenstein introduced, but it's caught on outside of those who agree with Wittgenstein, so that you probably hear us around in this department telling you, come on, do some philosophy, don't just talk about it in second-hand fashion. Get inside the guy's thinking and do some philosophy for yourself, you see. The philosophy is an activity of analysis, whatever else it be. It's at least that. Well, his point is then that philosophical propositions do not picture reality. Science does that. Science can only tell us about what can be thought and spoken in empirically verifiable ways. So science cannot tell you metaphysical matters, religious matters, unless it be by purely empirical means. And he says then, everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly. And what cannot be thought clearly, on that we must keep silence. Okay. Let me add just a couple of things to show how he applies this. inasmuch as he's advocating scientific empiricism, he's obviously going to run into the problem of induction. The uniformity of nature is the problem. It's on the assertion of the uniformity of nature that all inductive reasoning hinges. Well, here's what he says about this. The so-called law of induction cannot possibly be a law of logic, since it's obviously a proposition with sense. Now, a proposition with sense is one that refers to empirical data. The law of induction, the uniformity of nature, is referring to the uniformity of empirical data. So it's not a law of logic. Okay? Well, what about the law of causation, which underlies the law of induction in traditional philosophy? The law of causation is not a law, but only the form of a law. Law of causation is a general name. In mechanics, there are minimal principles, causal laws. In physics, there are causal laws. There is no the law of causation in general. It is simply the empty form of which particular causal laws participate. So it's stressing the logical structure of those laws. Let's see. In a little bit further on, the procedure of induction has no logical justification. Now that's David Hume all over again. But only a psychological justification. David Hume all over again. You see? Yeah, the psychological justification in that psychologically grounded belief in causation by virtue of the constant conjunctions that condition our expectations. And then this, there is no compulsion making one thing happen because another thing happened. There's no causal necessity. The only necessity that exists is logical necessity. That A cannot be non-A, for instance. No such thing as causal necessity. So the whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are explanations of natural phenomena. The laws of nature are not explanations of natural phenomena. The laws of nature are not laws. There's no necessity to them at all. Well, what about values, moral values? Okay, here's what he says about moral values. In the world, that is to say the world of facts, empirical facts, in the world everything is as it is, everything happens as it happens, in it no value exists. Because value is not an empirical fact. It's not empirically observable. If there is any value that does have value, it must lie outside the whole sphere of what happens in the world. Okay? Value would have to be something extraneous. It must lie outside the world. So, it is impossible for there to be propositions of ethics. What is a proposition? statement about states of affairs. Facts, empirical facts. So there are no propositions of ethics, no ethical propositions. Propositions can express nothing that is higher than facts. So it's clear that ethics cannot be put into words. What is an ethical law of the form "thou shalt"? When such a law is laid down, one's first thought is this: and what if I do not? Thou shalt, and what if I do not? It's clear that ethics has nothing to do with punishment and reward in the usual sense of the terms. So our question is about the consequences of an action, and it's unimportant. Those consequences shouldn't be events. For there must be something about the question we pose. There must be some kind of ethical reward and punishment that reside in the action itself. You see. Now, what then is the function of ethical language? Well, Wittgenstein doesn't come out and tell us. The logical positivist will say that ethical language is purely emotive. To say "thou shalt not steal" is simply emoting about some people's behavior. Venting feeling, not stating facts. There are no ethical facts to be recorded in propositions. So this leads then to the emotivist theory of ethics, which we're going to be meeting in Wittgenstein. You'll notice he has a chapter on ethics and aesthetics. Yeah. Then one or two final things. Death. Death, he says, is not an event in life. We don't live to experience death. Okay, so there is no empirical knowledge of death. Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limits. But there's no guarantee of temporal immortality of the human soul, survival after death. It's always been intended, or is some riddle solved by my surviving? The solution of the riddle of life, in that case, would lie outside of life itself, outside of space and time. The incongruities. Okay? No, but rather the solution of the problem is the solution of the problem of life and its meaning is seen in the vanishing of the problem. Because with death it vanishes. No life, no problem. All right, then finally this. This is the final. The correct method in philosophy must really be the following. To say nothing except what can be said, that is, propositions of natural science, and then whatever someone else wanted to say, to demonstrate that someone had failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his language. What we cannot speak about in empirical propositions